It is my pleasure to introduce the first Lifetime Achievement Award recipient of the INPCS, Dr. Jerome Kurent. Jerry's career has spent many decades dedicated to education, quality improvement, and spreading the palliative care world in neurology through courses, publications, and books. I know that many of you have attended his sessions at the American Academy of Neurology and elsewhere, and he was also a hospice director. He has certainly been encouraging to me and many others through his gentle and confident manner. And now we will hear from Dr. Kurent about his perspective on neuropalliative care.
Dr. Miyasaki, Dr. Kluger, ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, I can't quite find the words to adequately express my gratitude in receiving this prestigious award from the International Neuropalliative Care Society. But I thank you from the bottom of my heart in recognizing the vital role our mentors have played in advancing the field of neuropalliative care. Dr. Kathleen Foley is without equal as a role model and mentor in advocating for palliative care across the globe. Her influence on the development of palliative care is immeasurable. In working with Dr. Susan Block, the Project on Death in America Faculty Scholars Program was an anchor for many of us trying to establish our careers in palliative care. Dr. Richard Payne, powerful advocate for pain control, although no longer with us, is fondly remembered. Professor David Oliver has been an inspiration to me for more than 20 years since I first met him. I saw firsthand the amazing work he was doing in advocating for palliative care for patients with ALS-MND. I attempted to apply these principles to patient care for our ALS patients when I returned home. Dr. Joanne Lynn, geriatrician and advocate for patients nearing the end of life, first introduced me to end-of-life principles more than 25 years ago at an American Geriatric Society meeting just after I returned from my geriatric medicine fellowship. I had the privilege of meeting Dame Cecily Saunders, who provided a foundation of modern hospice care to all of us and to whom we are all eternally grateful. And lastly, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross brought death and dying to the front and center of our consciousness. To these luminaries and to so many unmentioned, my profound gratitude. So what I'd like to try to do is just to provide a brief review of the recent history of neuropalliative care as I experienced it over the last 20 to 25 years. And with that, past, a little bit about the present, and just looking to the future. So what I'd like to refer to as the early days of palliative care, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation initiated a Promoting Excellence in End-of-Life Care program in the late 1990s, and there were 17 grants provided across the country. We were the proud recipients of one such grant, and we focused on the African American community and how to improve palliative care services for that patient population in the greater Charleston area. The Project on Death in America program, faculty scholars program, and over a period of several years, I believe more than 40 physician faculty scholars. There was only one neurologist, and I had the privilege of being that neurologist. So at that time, neurologists, frankly, were just not that deeply involved in palliative care. It felt like a pretty lonely place at the time, and indeed it really was. Other initiatives in the late 1990s included the VA Faculty Leaders Project for Improved Care at the End of Life. We were one of the selected sites, and we were developing a curriculum for internal medicine residents. So the HRQ, Exploring Racial Differences Among Cancer and End-Stage Heart Failure Patients in South Carolina. One experience that stands out has to do with an interview I had with a prospective cardiology practice who were going to interview their patients in terms of the communicating terminal nature of their end-stage congestive heart failure. So I explained the goals to this particular representative, and he said, it's a good idea. Why don't you give me a call in a couple of weeks? We'll see what the board has to say about it, because it was a large practice spanning various parts of South Carolina. I called him back. He started out by saying, I think it's a good idea. It sounds like a good study. But the board basically doesn't think it's the right thing to do at this time. I asked him if he would just expand on that a little bit more, and he said, well, it's, quote, not in our mission statement. I asked him what he meant by that, and he says, well, we just don't talk about death and dying with our patients. Mind you, these were end-stage heart failure patients who had a finite, limited lifespan. So it's certainly illustrated the fact that people were not quite ready to confront death and dying, either in terms of confronting their own mortality, or they didn't want to impart a negative message to their patients. Anyhow, I think we've changed somewhat since then, but still have a way to go. The National Institutes of Health, largely through the NINR and NIA, provided some modest funding for palliative and end-of-life care projects. Virtually nothing came through the Neurological Institute. CAPC, outstanding, solid support for palliative care over the many years. We're very familiar with CAPC and indebted to their outstanding work. Hospice Medicare benefit in the U.S. has been present and alive since 1982, and the NHPCO has been with us as stalwart supporters of our work. The American Academy of Neurology, as you know, has many sections, including, up until recently, a pain and palliative care section and an NAA and ethics section. I had the privilege of chairing both of those sections at one time or another, and as part of that, we had a committee on sections which kind of evaluated the overall integrity of the sections. And there was a movement at some point around 15, 18 years ago to combine the pain and palliative care section along with the ethics section. I was in strong opposition to that because I felt palliative care had a future and didn't want to really dilute that with another section. Both sections were pretty small, probably having memberships of 200, give or take a few folks. So fast forward, all of a sudden we have a neuropalliative care section, freestanding, all by itself, outstanding work, job well done, a lot of progress due to strong leadership and powerful advocacy. As proof, living proof, neuropalliative care book, edited by Drs. Creutzfeldt, Kluger, and Holloway. Outstanding read if any of you haven't seen the book yet, but certainly indicates outstanding progress in neuropalliative care in our part of the world. We have to pay tribute to our colleagues in the UK, Canada, and Europe because they were actually quite ahead of us in palliative care, I believe, but we're catching up and greatly admire all the beautiful work they've done over the years. The AAN again sponsored a number of courses related to palliative care. I had the privilege of being the director of the ones listed here. I was quite surprised with the advanced palliative care for ALS, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's, not quite sure what sort of reception we've had. And to my surprise, we had standing room only audience of, I believe, a capacity crowd of 100 attendees. And so the next 3 years, for a total of 4 years, that proved to be a very successful and a good program. It involved a lot of attendees. Neuroethics and end-of-life care, vegetative state, and neurogeriatrics were others. And as a little advice to folks wanting to prepare for programs for the AAN, it makes a lot of sense to try to do some cross-collaboration between the various sections. So if you can involve ethics with palliative care, maybe with geriatrics, and have members of those various sections all contribute to the course, I think you find a lot of interest by the AAN. This is a beautiful thread and fabric piece of artwork that actually was a reproduction of photographs taken in chronic care facilities and I believe at home in some settings. And the beauty of this particular work shows the increasing cultural diversity in the aging population that we experience here in the United States and frankly in other parts of the world as well. There's a particular need to provide palliative care for our African American partners, and it's been kind of hard to reach out to them in many cases. There's been a well-founded suspicion, frankly, on distrust of the medical establishment, which we're slowly trying to improve, but we still have a lot of work to do. As part of that program, we were funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and one of 17 grants across the country, and our focus was on providing a needs assessment within the African American community in the greater Charleston area. Our job was to determine avoidance and preferences near the end of life for African American patients. The key elements of our project: we developed an advisory board on end-of-life care. We had focus groups, 7 different focus groups. We had several times over a year and a half. We developed a minister's curriculum at the request of the ministers themselves on the advisory board. And the key participants of the entire project were recruited from the enterprise community, namely the geographic area serving this particular African American patient population. We had a lot of rich array of findings that we presented at national meetings and in publications. We thought it was really important to involve members of our advisory council, pictured here, largely consisting of ministers and spouses and retired teachers from the community, along with members of the project formation staff itself. Some of the things we found influencing culture and ethnicity included overriding sanctity of life and a mistrust of the medical establishment, often displayed by African American patients and healthy people. Autonomy, moving down. While we consider this front and center issue in the USA and in some other parts of the world, in much of the world though, decisions are not autonomous around decision making at the end of life and frequently involve group decision making by family members. Just something to remind ourselves about as we think about international approaches to palliative care. This next slide simply illustrates a listing of project leaders. We thought it was important to involve members of the community project at national meetings, and so in front of this poster at an American Hospice and Palliative Care meeting, we find ministers. We found a national leader with Dr. Bernice Harper in the middle, who was focused on palliative care in sub-Saharan Africa. We enlisted her help as a consultant. But the bottom line is we tried to involve all of the participating community members as much as we could from the beginning and to the end of the project, including national meetings listed here: American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine, Neurology, General Internal Medicine. Fast forward right around the time I left my geriatric medicine fellowship, mid-career fellowship, and we had a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation grant. I thought it was time to put some of our rapidly increasing knowledge in the form of a book. And my colleague, Dr. George Taylor, cardiologist, very involved in palliative care, and I co-edited a book that we felt would be a useful resource for people starting out in palliative care. And we think it accomplished that goal. Fast forward, selected areas of ALS MND public policy around 3 or 4 years ago, thought about the importance of trying to get a far-reaching sense of public policy and how it affected patients with ALS and MND across the globe. So Professor David Oliver, our other colleague, Robert Blank, who's a public policy expert, and myself, enlisted the collaboration of around over 50 ALS MND experts from over 21 countries across the globe and asked them to focus for the respective countries on various aspects of public policy, some of which are listed here on slide 1 and some on slide 2. For example, what is the legal status of advance directives, or do they have them at all? In some cases they didn't. What about palliative sedation, medical aid in dying, euthanasia? Where did ALS patients die? What factors were unique to each country in terms of the respective WHO designated high, low, and middle income countries? And as recently noted by Drs. Gordon and Kreutzfeldt, they pointed out the need to implement guidelines for ALS palliative care, even though we might have ironclad, evidence-based guidelines. Let's use what we have until we get more advanced evidence. On the subject of ethics, it's hard to separate ethics from public policy because it's an integral part of everything we do. I highly recommend this book by Dr. Jim Burnett at Dartmouth. This is the third edition. It's just an absolute outstanding volume, loaded with relevant, pertinent ethics, very readable, and I encourage everyone to at least take a look at this book. What are some of the selected ethical issues in ALS-MND care? Well, breaking bad news, abandonment, decisions around feeding tubes, tracheostomy and mechanical ventilation, genetic testing for patients at risk where there's a clear family history, medical aid in dying, etc. A lot of ethics. And so what we did was assemble all the information we obtained from the more than 50 ALS-MD experts from 21 countries and published them in the form of a book released earlier this year. We feel it's a treasure trove of information related specifically to ALS-MND and public policy and how it impacts the care of our patients with ALS-MND. So briefly, the map illustrates the countries starting in North and South America, Africa, much of Europe, Israel, China, Russia, Pakistan, India, South Korea, Japan, and Australia, illustrated and listed alphabetically here with a lot of associated demographics that I don't expect you to be able to read on this particular slide. Just focusing on one particular element of policy and access, it has to do with palliative care and hospice. And on your far left, where you see widespread access, relatively speaking, to palliative care and hospice, these are largely high-income countries. And as you go from left to right, progressively from then to medium-income countries down to low-income countries, where there is virtually no access or hardly awareness of palliative care and hospice. So the take-home message here is there is tremendous disparity across the globe. No surprise to all of us. We're living in a privileged society for sure. Next slide raises the question of whether or not we can translate some of the findings that we identified in the ALS-MND study to palliative care. And I think some of the same public policies apply to palliative care. First and foremost, what is the extent of public awareness and of awareness of people? I mean, 20, 25 years ago, the term palliative care was pretty much a foreign concept in our country here. Patients didn't know what palliative care was. Now it's pretty much in everyone's vocabulary. What is the availability of trained professionals? What about some of the ethical considerations? And last but not least, what is the extent of governmental and institutional support for palliative care? These are all very critical to the successful development of palliative care. And finally, in closing, hope is faith holding out its hand in the dark, and I think that's where we come in as palliative care providers, professionals. Our humanism, I think, is a vehicle to reach out, comfort patients where hope may be nothing more than having a peaceful death or having a spiritual peace at the end of life. That's our duty to try to provide this to our patients and families. And as Anatole Briard poignantly observed, this was a quote provided by Dr. Kathleen Foley several years ago. Mr. Briard was an editor-writer for the New York Times and accomplished writer in his own right. He said, "The doctor has little to lose and everything to gain by letting the sick man into his or her heart. If he does not, they can share as few others the wonder, terror, and exultation on being on the edge of being." And I think that's our challenge as palliative care providers, neuropalliative care doctors, and providers. How do we reach out to these patients in time of need and provide them the good death and support that they all deserve? Thank you very much for your attention. Keep up the inspiration. Keep supporting each other. The goal is to do the very best we can for our patients and families. We have the need. We have the means to do that. Thank you again.